Good morning, everybody. My name is Eric Clay. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Flare. Also, I am the co-lead of Threat Intelligence Research. We have two guests who we've had before today. We have Nick Ascoli. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, folks. I'm Nick Ascoli. I am the Senior Product Strategist here at Flare, which means I help decide what Flare is going to do next and how we're going to do it. And I'm also a member of our Threat Intel Research team. And Jason?
Hey, everybody. My name is Jason Haddix. I'm Field CISO here at Flare. So I work with Eric and Nick doing all kinds of fun stuff, but mostly I talk about security topics related to the kind of stuff that Flare does, credential exposure, threat intelligence, things like that. And I've been around the security industry for a long, long time. Also a hacker in my free time, bug bounty researcher.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, guys. So we have an exciting conversation today. And I say it's exciting because we have no formal topics. We just scheduled a webinar. We jumped on. We're going to have a conversation, which is always the most fun. Yeah. So I'm going to start by, I want to ask for kind of like future predictions about 2025, because things are changing really, really rapidly. And I'm sure we're going to touch on a bunch of different topics. But I would love your guys' thoughts on like where ransomware is going, where the cybercrime ecosystem is going, and then kind of on the flip side, and especially to you, Jason, how CISOs and how security teams need to be thinking about kind of this like rapidly changing landscape. Like you have, because now you don't have things changing on just one axis. For example, you don't have just like the cybercrime ecosystem evolving, malware evolving, ransomware tactics evolving. You also have like Gen AI, which is like this also rapidly evolving thing. Hopefully not literally yet. And so you've got these kind of two things that security teams are probably a little overwhelmed by. But let's start with you, Nick. What do you think about ransomware and the cybercrime ecosystem in 2025?
Well,
make a bold prediction. Nobody's expecting.
Well, the most bold prediction I can give is it'll be more commercialized. Shocker. The overwhelming the cybercrime ecosystem, especially as it relates to info stealers, which is a particularly topical thing here at Flare, has become commodified to a degree that has made previously complex cybercrime trivial, genuinely trivial. The level of tutorial and instruction and availability of, things like taking over an active session using a stolen cookie is unbelievably simple and has been, like I said, commodified to the point of being extremely affordable as well. I think commodification will continue. And I think specifically with regards to ransomware, something interesting, and we have a new show that we just recently launched that I haven't really done much promo for, but called Leaky Weekly, where we talk about like the last week in data leak news. And one of the stories from this week is another one of those like interesting scenarios where I think ransomware has evolved a little bit. It's devolved in some ways. There are other stories we can talk about that, but it's evolved in a specific attack that Unit 42 uncovered and put out an awesome report on, which was a campaign that looked for exposed ENV files, which store variables of many kind for a variety of technical reasons. And this campaign would look in exposed ENV files, specifically in S3 buckets that were public, pull out AWS access keys from that, and then enumerate from those keys that they found which keys could actually be used to do something, which had permissions necessary to do something. If a key did have permission necessary to do something, then a part of this campaign would be create a new account in the IAM of the AWS tenant that you're in that has permission to do everything. And then they would copy all of the data out of every single bucket, send it back home to their own S3 buckets, and leave a note. And the note was a ransom note that read very similar to a ransomware, note that ends up on a computer when a machine is encrypted, that says, we have all your data. We've stolen it. We'll make it public. If you don't pay us X amount of Bitcoin to, or X amount of Monero, or X amount of whatever, to this wallet. And I think that's interesting for a number of reasons. One is it's another feather in the cap of ransomware without the wear. Now, like, there's not encryption going on here. There's not really much being deployed. These are AWS API endpoints being used basically as they were designed, just a sort of slight misconfiguration or accidentally exposed file on the individual who's hosting that ENV file. This is like much like with Snowflake. This is not AWS's fault. These are misconfigurations or lack of configurations in tenants, AWS tenants themselves. So bad guys are looking at SaaS tools in the same way. They know that everyone is moves their data now overwhelmingly to infrastructure as a service backends. So now maybe ransoming a whole collections of hosts and exfiltrating all the data off of those hosts in a company might not yield as interesting results as just ransoming S3 itself, literally ransoming their cloud buckets. So I have a potentially unfortunate prediction of more attacks that look like that S3 ransom campaign, because this is kind of things like that have happened before, but it's kind of one of the earlier large scale campaigns in that world that we'll see more things like that. Ransomware will, I'm sure, continue steaming right ahead as it has, but these new sort of evolutions of extortion campaigns, I think will, right now they're maybe a little early. They'll probably become increasingly commodified and trivial to execute, and will probably, potentially grow in scope. So that's one bold prediction, maybe not so bold, but what do you guys think?
So I timed you, Nick. I was going to time you in this webinar to see how long it took you to say the words cloud bucket, and we made it 3 minutes in.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty good. That might be a new record. Jason, what do you have to say there? And I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think I agree with a lot of stuff Nick is saying. So I have the fortunate or unfortunate experience of being a big enterprise CISO, right, with my history at Ubisoft. And I think just from me staying in the CISO community a lot and talking with a lot of friends who are dealing with, this kind of stuff day in, day out, is that we're just going to see a lot more. Unfortunately, what happened was with the kind of progress we made this year of finding and litigating against, groups like Lockbit, right, and Lapsus, what happens when you take down one of those sites is they scatter like rats into other smaller groups and forums and chats and stuff like that. And then it becomes less easy to track some of those splintered groups, who are not centralized like Lockbit was. Although, some people will say that Lockbit is still alive and going. I don't know if it's the same people, but yeah, so I mean, you're still seeing a lot of decentralization of the underground market, meaning that people are trying to do the things they do really best. Phishing, kingpins are still out there, doing phish, providing initial access people, and then moving on to ransomware people. And then, now people are starting to branch out into other stuff. I had a really interesting conversation actually with a friend who works at Cloudflare. And so you guys know that I'm really big into the bug bounty scene. And I was talking to him, and I hadn't really thought about this much, right? But he was telling me about how a lot of the threat actors who are looking for kind of the stuff you're talking about, Nick, is exposed buckets and what they can do with that. Same thing with exposed information on GitHub and stuff like that, are actually following the lead of some of the research that bug bounty hunters do. And so they were seeing bug bounty hunter blogs and stuff like that in kind of the chatter of the dark web people and how to monetize some of the techniques. And so it's really interesting to see that they're moving into these non-lockdown type of methods, and we've known about this in the security community, with things like gray hat warfare and stuff like that, and what kind of stuff can leak out of S3 buckets. And a lot of people, when I tell them that S3 buckets still go unconfigured, they're like, that's still a thing today? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And it's the same kind of answer that so many people, or the same kind of reaction so many people have when I tell them, yeah, developers are still hopping on their personal GitHub account and posting corporate code to public GitHub repos that's not on the corporate repo, and passwords are getting leaked and environment variables are getting leaked. And so they're like, oh, I thought we were moving past that because of security features in the platform. And it just, people think these are solved problems before we've actually implemented the solutions. So I see a lot more pain, unfortunately, in 2025 because we are kind of shifting a little bit to new topics, right? We're shifting to AI, we're shifting to stronger IAM and cloud security and stuff like that. But we're still going to see a lot of ransomware in 2025. I have two friends who are in active incidents right now with threat actors. And when I talk to them, kind of Chatham House rules, these are not hardcore exploitation initial access methods that these actors use. It's very much up Flare's alley, where it's like a password to something was the initial access, and then they pivoted on the internal network. And at least what I'm finding, at least from discussing with them, is there are old school threat actors and kind of new school threat actors. And the new school threat actor will sit on your network for longer without doing anything and just probe your network for days or weeks at a time to find out, what your infrastructure is like, what your network architecture is like, where the traffic is going. And then they will collect all that information and then strike really quickly before your SOC has any time to react, right? If they haven't found that initial access immediately, right? There's a lot of growth and a lot of pivoting to do for kind of new school blue teamers, I think.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting points I could pivot off of in that answer, Jason. I think there's two that really come immediately to mind. First of all, I feel like a lot of people in we talk a lot about security, we talk about threat actors, and kind of like the state of the cybercrime ecosystem. And I feel like in a lot of cases, like it's very divorced from geopolitics because they're such different topics, right? Like very few people are both experts in like cybersecurity and geopolitics. But I do feel it's very, very relevant because when you look at it, right, you talk about, you break a block bet, they all go somewhere else. One of the core problems we're dealing with here is a lot of these actors are based in Russia or other non-extradition countries, where even if you personally identify who did an attack, nothing's going to happen to them. And so they can just go on to the next group. And so you can disrupt the operations, but you can't actually disrupt the actors. And I think that's a really, really salient point. The other thing I think is really interesting, Jason and Nick as well, is this basic. So we talk a lot about cloud buckets. We've talked about GitHub. There seems to be, it seems like the rate of technological adoption. So secure, like the IT infrastructure and companies are adopting way more IT than they can successfully defend. Like there's just this gap where it's like people are adopting new technologies, new SaaS apps, setting up new infrastructure, and the security teams just can't keep up. Would you agree or disagree with that statement? Or am I looking at it in a totally wrong way?
I don't think we've graduated even past some of the things that we think we've graduated past. So if you look at kind of the bigger CVEs that have happened this year, they're all against web apps that control VPN concentrators, routers, firewalls, security infrastructure. And there are these web apps that are tied to those things. And they're having remote code execution type vulnerabilities against these web apps. And so we haven't even moved past the web app level yet in security, and we're still having these crazy things. I mean, I think there was a total between the end of last year and all of this year so far, 12 remote code execution CVEs against different pieces of infrastructure that are on the hit list for pen testers and red teamers like me, right? They're the first 12 things I look at when I look at a scope for an organization or something like that. So we haven't moved a ton past, even some stuff that I think that a lot of people assume that we've moved past, honestly.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, the landscape of understanding, I think around LOL, there were LOL bins, there were LOL drivers. Now it's almost like there are LOL APIs, figuring out how to use all of the exposed AWS endpoints using a valid access key to do all the things you want to do, using them as intended, right? By using them for your gain, but with the intended design of the endpoint such that you're not actually flagging some kind of, behavioral signal, but maybe some anomaly detection rule, is growing with the incredible accessibility of cloud training. In the attack I talked about specifically, these guys are obviously cloud engineers, potentially is their day job, right? They understand these cloud environments with a level of specificity that they've obviously engineered large scale applications to run in these cloud environments. I'm not saying they're definitely cloud engineers, but it was pretty sophisticated compared to the things you see people usually throwing against public APIs. And to your point about not having simple questions answered, I think even the idea of a CMDB is still, and it was a challenge, was almost internally starting to be well understood. And then now with the massive proliferation of, the adoption of web apps at a scale that the security team can't even keep up with, it's in many ways become easier to enumerate what web apps you have, and in many ways has also become more difficult and at times impossible. So like shadow IT remains a substantial problem even with a well-configured CASB.
So this is a great kind of offshoot topic, because as a leader who sits in the chair of the CISO at a big organization, it's actually easier to control shadow IT at a small organization that doesn't have a lot of employees, that doesn't have fractured business units that are global and so many people. Like what you're seeing a lot is a despair among leaders right now, or among CISOs. It's just like, how do I come into this CISO job or graduate into it or get hired into it and actually execute a security program for a large organization? Is it hopeless? This is actually things that like my CISO friends are like, hey, am I going to take this job? And it's just, I'm only here for 3 years because it's my next thing. And like, how do I retrofit this security program that doesn't exist, that's nested under, maybe IT or governance or something like that. And you're almost too big to succeed, at some of these places, right? Because there's so many business units and things like that. And I would pose that question to you guys. Like, how do you feel like, like, is it a lost cause? Do we pivot completely from prevention to react, like internal reaction and response? Like, what do you guys think?
So I do want to make one point very quickly, which is Nick said it, not me, but not all cloud engineers are threat actors, but all threat actors are cloud engineers. So, Jason, to your point, I had a CISO one time compare the job of being a CISO to being a goat tied out in Jurassic Park for the T-Rex to eat. Which
that is what it feels like sometimes. Yeah.
I think it's like naturally a really hard job, right? Like when you think of like a marketing job or a sales job or something, like what you're doing is very directly tied to kind of like the business outcome. And so is security, but security is in a very different way, because you have to go and say like, hey, all of these things, all these other departments are doing right now are wrong. And I'm going to make it harder. And I can't tell you exactly what the return on investment of making everything harder is going to be, but it's going to be harder, but we're going to be safer. Like that's the basic pitch. And it's a really hard pitch to make in a business context. And I think you see certain organizations do a really good job. Like I have friends at some of like the big social media companies, of the big tech companies, and whatever else you might say about them, they do a really nice job on security. Like they take it super seriously. They invest the resources. It's like a culture of security. And then you talk to, I talked to a 30,000 person like healthcare company at one point, and they're like, oh yeah, we're like acquiring businesses every 2 weeks. We just like hook them up to our infrastructure. We have no visibility whatsoever. And it's like, oh, well, good thing you guys aren't in an important field or anything.
Yeah.
And so I feel, I'm going to be very negative and contrarian and probably get in trouble, but I think it's probably hopeless for most companies that aren't willing to like take it seriously from like a business level first, and then push that culture and that belief on down. Like if you're coming in as a CISO or security team and it's like, hey, we're going to invest like the bare minimum. We're not going to force anybody to do anything they don't want to do. And we're not going to give you appropriate resources. Like I don't see, you can do your best to mitigate risk, but it really is going to be very reactive. Nick, how about you?
This is a very hard question to answer, because I would never give up proactive activities. I would never give up trying to sweep every suite you own and every, internal and external network that exists for what your assets are, where they live, how you can harden them, and how you can, log the activity from them for prevention. That said, I recognize, I think, you should just do your best and pat yourself on the back and take a breather and not stay up all night stressing over it, because it is a nearly impossible task to have a complete grasp. Like no matter what you do, there's someone in accounting or finance or marketing. Sorry, Eric, who's signing themselves up. Only. Who's signing themselves up for some tool that on a personal device using their work email that you did not subscribe to, and then logging into it through SSO, and then a stealer log hits that device, and then boom, 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 all your protections were outstanding, and you should have done them, and great job for doing them. But in the eyes of the business, things still might not end well because of one small lapse in controls that like you really could almost have not influenced in any meaningful way anyway. So my answer is don't give up.
I like it. I like the positive answer, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it can be helpful too. Like you've got compliance requirements to meet, but I also think it can be helpful to look at like something like the IBM X-Force report. Like what are the top ways threat actors are getting in, and treat it like a checklist. Okay, I'm going to start with, even if I'm under-resourced, I'm going to start with number one, credentials. How can I make sure that we have like very optimal coverage here, and how can we, enhance our two-factor authentication protections for everything we do? Okay, lookalike domains and phishing. I could do like that's so a lot of these, even if you don't have the, so I'm going to be a little more optimistic than I was previously and say, even if you don't have the $100 million budget, you can at least check up, even if you don't have state-of-the-art tools, you can at least check basic boxes, kind of going down the list of, okay, we've got credentials, we have lookalike domains, we're using two-factor authentication. Like these are very achievable.
Yeah, I think that's where most modern security leaders are coming up from. They're coming up from having been blue teamers their whole life, right? Like SOC managers, incident responders, and you're starting to see security programs that are designed both from top-down needs like compliance and stuff like that, but now bottom up reverse engineering of what threat actors are doing. I see a lot more people doing what you're saying, Eric, which is like, okay, let's take the Verizon breach report, let's take the X-Force report, let's take all of these, let's put them into our own internal list, see what applies to us, as it pertains to what kind of business we run, and then use those things that are common in all those reports and build our table stakes off of that, and a couple of things we need from the top down too. And I think that those security programs, especially because we went kind of like in the industry, in the security industry, we went real hard left, I guess you would call it, to pivoting to like AppSec and product security really hard in a lot of businesses. And we kind of forgot about CorpSec a little bit, which is where the credential problem lies and where a lot of initial access comes from ransomware these days and stuff like that. So now we're starting to equalize a little bit. But the security industry has this problem where the new sexy thing is the thing that everybody wants to talk about. And, right now it's AI, right? But they forget about kind of like, the older stuff that was like the previous generation, and they don't finish that problem first.
Zero trust. Yes, there's always a new. Do you feel that we're moving on from zero trust to AI now, Jason, or are we going to go to zero trust AI driven zero trust?
Yeah.
AI powered zero trust.
Yeah. Hey, I'm all about AI. It's cool. It's just like, but it's part of a complete breakfast. So.
Yep.
How do you see advances? So I don't know if have you had a chance to use GPT-4.0 or not GPT-4.0, GPT-01. The naming schemas are very confusing.
Yeah.
Do you think that augurs anything different from security than say like the base kind of like 4 models like Sonnet or GPT-4.0, or do you think it's like kind of more of the same, maybe a little bit better on certain axes?
I mean, at least in my usage, what GPT-01 feels like is it feels like GPT-4.0 enhanced with basically chain of thought prompting, which is this idea of you talk through in the prompting. You make the AI work step by step, and some short-term memory storage and an agenting framework that can do some search. And I feel like that is all in a trench coat, 01. I think that right now there are some issues with like efficacy and token usage, but everything I've done with it right now for security, as long as I prompt it really well, it has performed really, really well. So I still have to use a lot of like prompt engineering to get it to work for me in security. Like, let's say I want it to be a first responder incident response plan. I have to put a lot into the prompt engineering for it to start, but then once it goes off and does its thing, it's fantastic. So, I think that is a very cool step. It's not GPT-5, which, we've seen some news, honestly, in the last couple of days about like, some rumors about what GPT-5 will be and stuff like that. So, but it's amazing so far. And honestly, it's the public's first, it's their first exposure to a framework that can do some small agenting and some, like RAG and stuff like that, some topics inside of AI that are really important to make AI systems better. So I'm all for it. I think it's a good step in the right direction right now.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Nick, have you had a chance to use GPT-01?
I have, not in any meaningful way, just to write a couple simple Python scripts, but honestly, to overwhelmingly more success than I was able to with 4 and 4.0 for specifically. I'm only using GPTs to write me scripts. LLM. So
it's a good use case.
My framework for assessment is always how many times did I have to tell it this Python library does not exist, or keep asking it to rework logic. But I don't know. I see improvements, definitely.
And Jason, so you mentioned, when you're prompting it for security, can you give a couple use cases of like how you would use a language model, whether it's 4.0, whether it's 0.1? That they really should come up with a better naming schema. I'm very disappointed in their naming schema. Like I'll give it to Anthropic, like Sonnet. It's very nice. It's easy to say. And here I'm trying to remember, like, is it 0.1 or 0.1 or 4.0?
I kind of liked 0.1, even though the naming scheme was like not uniform, because like the lowercase o and the 1 looks like a salute. So that's how I remember 0.1, like the emoji. But so when you prompt this kind of stuff, you want to provide it with as much context to your problem, at least in 0.1 right now, that in the first shot, because it has trouble at the moment recalling like a conversation, right? It does fill in context from your conversation, just like every model does, but user kind of benchmarking right now is like, oh, the first conversation you have with it, or the first message you send it, it will not be able to recall things from that conversation all the time. And so the first shot message that you send to the AI or to the model has to be really, really good, which, normally when I prompt for security issues, you want to fill it with the context and exactly what you want it to do. So the problem you're trying to solve, what you've done so far to do it, and then related research terms is another thing I do all the time with AI stuff. So with security. So like, let's say I'm talking about exploitation and I want 0.1 to help me write an exploit of some sort. I will seed the context of the first message with related topics around exploitation, like reverse engineering and shellcode and payloads and stuff like that. And what that does is it hones in on the research in the training data that has to do with everything that I want to know about. And so I get better responses out of the bots when I include related research terms in my searches. So that's one tip of mine that I always do with all my prompts.
Yeah. So thank you, Jason. I think that's a great response. We're going to shift to some audience questions because we have a lot of activity. But if you have more questions, please put them in the chat. We can actually shift. If we have enough questions, I'll shift the whole of the last 15 minutes or 17 minutes we have to audience questions. I will say that the game-breaking use case for GPT for me is I write a ton. Now, I don't write with GPT. Anytime I read something, I could tell immediately if it was GPT written. But it is an amazing proofreader. I no longer have to have other people look at my work because I could write something, give it to GPT, it proofreads it, and I put it in and it's perfect. Yeah. So that is a fantastic use case too.
Yeah. Well, actually, another interesting use case, Eric, in the world of cybercrime is like reasonably accurate colloquial translations of foreign languages that aren't yours. Yep. So like you feed it as a prompt something from a Russian cybercrime forum, and you say, what does this mean? If you translated it directly, it's not, overwhelmingly with Russian specifically, sometimes it's not going to make any sense when translated. If you ask it to translate, tell me what this is about, it will be able to wrap its head around context and colloquialisms that are used in the chat that really won't make sense on translation, as we've seen many times looking through chatter ourselves, that work really well. You can understand the actual point the person is trying to get across by bashing it against a GPT better than you can if looking at it in Google Translate. Of course, the best is finding a native speaker and asking them what this means. But GPT has actually, we've seen, be pretty reliable for us in translating cybercrime chatter in context.
Really funny story about this very briefly, and then I promise we'll take audience questions, is we got it, like there was a guide on the dark web for how to distribute, like how to run info stealer campaigns. And we got this guide. It's very interesting. So we have a copy of this guide, and it's clearly something somebody wrote in Russian and then used either Google Translate or GPT to translate into English for, those English speaking people who might be reading their guide. And for whatever reason, the victims in the guide, like, how to attract people to your, fake Google ads campaign or whatever. The victims in the guide are referred to as the furries, the furry ones. And so it's like to attract the furry ones to your Google ad, right? Like Elon Musk, free Bitcoin, 0.5 Bitcoin, click now.
Is that tech
And, like,
people? Is the furry ones?
The furry ones,
I
yes.
guess.
These are all the victims are the furry ones. So like when you're attracting the furry ones, like you want to use Elon Musk because everybody loves Elon Musk in America.
All right.
It's really funny.
All right.
So we have multiple questions. So let's start with Jeff Anderson. I didn't see this question. It was at 11:06 a.m. So I'm going to guess we were talking about info stealer malware.
I think that was buckets.
And buckets, okay. Buckets, even better. So Nick, I'm going to bat this one over to you because you are the
Sure.
bucket man.
So
What are the articles, resources?
Okay, the articles, first of all, I will drop this in chat. I hope my chat works like yours, Jeff. This is the report by Unit 42, which is awesome. They are a great, an awesome research team. So check out that article. That has all the details. If you scroll down to mitigations, a lot of it is they're talking about in their ecosystem of Palo Alto products. But outside of the ecosystem, I would say recon is the answer to your questions here. Prevention is take stock of whatever the equivalent is in the cloud service you use. But let's assume it's AWS. Take stock of your buckets internally using the S3 API. Enumerate the buckets you have with your account. And then attempt to, from a separate public internet connection, attempt to view the contents of those buckets publicly. First of all, to see, is this bucket public that's not supposed to be? Second of all, internally, there's a whole host of ways to do this, but audit your IAM for the permissions behind the accounts that can access those buckets. And this is specific.
Uh-oh. Did Nick cut out?
To this prescriptive to the service that they are intended to access. In the sense that did you lose me for a second? I saw my internet chop up. Okay.
You're back.
But I would say, first of all, the initial foothold here is an ENV file. So you'll want to make sure that you are not exposing that ENV file on a public bucket that contains an AWS access key. So recon, like the bad guy would, against you first to see what it is in the outside that they're looking for. Understand their approach here and execute it against yourself. And then obviously look inside, audit the permissions of your of the AWS roles you have. Make sure data is segmented properly. Make sure things aren't over-permissed. Be on the lookout for massive increases in the execution of specific read APIs or list APIs that will be, clearly pulling down massive amounts of data that is not normally happening in the course of business in your AWS tenant. So, basic anomaly detection in spikes of volume, and also, using running the recon against yourself to seeing what's exposed would be, I think, good places to start that are relatively easy to execute. Jason, what do you think?
I think I agree. As far as places to look for these types of kind of security leaks that both bad guys and like bug bounty hunters will submit to your bug bounty programs. The two hottest ones right now are cloud storage buckets. So it's not just AWS, right? It's GCP and everything else. Misconfigured cloud buckets. So you can find those internally via your configuration APIs and usually your dashboards as well. The problem what you'll have is that development groups that are not the main development group of an enterprise organization will start up their own AWS account on their own credit card and start hosting data there for some program. Or you'll have a SaaS company that you work with and they're like, hey, we need an AWS bucket to do a data integration. And so people will stand that up outside of your kind of knowledge and outside of your AWS corporate account. And so that's where the stuff Nick talks about comes in, about trying to find stuff. So there are services out there that will monitor buckets. I mentioned one called Grey Hat Warfare, where you can just do a keyword search on your business name and see where that shows in buckets. And the other hotbed is GitHub, right? In which there are open source tools that'll help you monitor GitHub for leaks of developers who put stuff in their normal GitHub account and not the corporate repo, right? And leak data that way. There's a hit list of files you should monitor. So your .env file is just one of the files you should, monitor in that way. The problem is that the tooling that does this kind of monitoring is still very hackerish, right? It's still very, you need to be on a Linux command line to run some of this. Enterprise tools haven't got around to this configuration kind of security drift. Not a lot of tools have. Flare is probably one of the only ones I know that does really good GitHub parsing for stuff. And so like what happens is if you want to get ahead of these problems, you end up having to put your pretty technical engineers on the command line running open source tools that you get off of GitHub, which is not a capability every security team has, right? And so, we're having to get more technical in some of these areas if we want to stay on top of this kind of drift. So,
all right.
Thanks.
Our next question is, for large organizations, the amount of leaked credentials is huge. The ratio of garbage versus credible credentials is high. How can a large org approach this problem systematically? Nick, let's start with you.
Well, you can figure out what credentials are. First of all, you probably know credentials are garbage, right? If you're seeing just combo list after combo list of the same username and password being recycled, boom. Immediate, ignore anything that has showed up several times and we already took care of. I would say you want to get the ratio down. You only want to look for, you want to be alerting yourself to a unique combination on credentials specifically of the username and the password. So the same one showing up in a bunch of different breaches over and over again. You've already hopefully mitigated that combo in your environment. You're looking for a net new combo on that email. Stop showing me the same old combo, even if it showed up again. I don't care. I don't care. This is dealt with in my environment. And secondly, there are types of credentials that leak that are more important than others. And if you can find these, if you can enumerate the service those credentials came from, like a big leak of LinkedIn, potentially impacts the user. They may reuse the password, but, not necessarily big internal connections to you that matter. If you can enumerate the URL that login is for, one of two ways. One, if that leaked credentials from a stealer log, of course, this is orders of magnitude more important than, a combo list, someone's backend that was hacked and their username and password database was leaked, versus either a stealer log or a ULP. The value of both of those things, a ULP, by the way, is it's like a combo list for stealer logs where threat actors will collect themselves tons and tons of stealer logs and then make a ULP on a specific URL. So they'll say, I'm selling 100,000 creds to Azure. And what that means is they look through stealer logs for portal.azure.com as the login, pulled all those credentials and made a big compilation of those. So they didn't hack Azure. They didn't hack some third-party tool using Azure. They collected these credentials, potentially, live unused creds from tons and tons and tons of stealer logs, repackaged them and sold them. The value of a ULP and a stealer log is the exact service. So you can be looking for your SSO. You can be looking for your, Git infrastructure. You can be looking for things that that have access to data that really matters, or have the ability to get access to data, laterally move themselves into data that really matters. So I would say prioritizing credential resets, first of all, by service when it can be done is awesome. And second, long tail, the same username and password combo repeating a million times. You don't care about that big chunk in the beginning. You really care about the individual ones in the long tail popping up from a ULP from a stealer in a specific chat. I've seen people post creds in shout box on breach forums before. You want to be looking for those odd one-offs that really, really matter versus the big combo list that keep getting chunked out there. I think that's a place to start, at least.
And Jason, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, so I actually built out a framework for this. I think Eric, you've seen it. I don't know, Nick, if you've seen the mind map that I made, the levels of care of. Yeah. So I think as someone who consumes a large list of credentials, right, I think that there are levels. I have 6 different levels that I categorize as which ones you take care of first, right? So starting at the least impactful are definitely probably what you're getting inundated with, and you're even asking this question about is stuff that just gets posted as breach dumps, which is usually hacks of websites and their SQL databases get dumped with passwords or password hashes on the public web, and they eventually make their way into, after they've been traded around the hacker ecosystem, they make their way to Pastebin or dehashed or, some like low level, type of like service or something like that. So worry less about those because you've probably already done password resets that have, mitigated something like that. And that wasn't a malware level breach. It was a credential level breach. Then you have level 2, which is the forum ecosystem. So things like Russian Market, XSS.com, things like that are being traded in the big forums. Those are a little bit more behind private doors or harder to get to just a tiny bit. And so that's like level 2. Level 3 is like the RAS market, which used to be Lockbit, but now is a fractured ecosystem of people trading ransomware credentials that they've pilfered from internal networks usually. And then level 4 is stealer logs. And so that's where the hotness is for me as a red teamer, because I have to think like an adversary. And that's sale and advertisement of credentials through WhatsApp, Telegram, and Discord right now are the hot places. And so those are the ones you have to worry about because not only are they more fresh and that's the first place that they're getting kind of exposed, they're also represented from actual computers being taken over rather than just a database like a SQL database getting leaked of username and passwords. And so you have to worry about that because like even if the user changes their password or you do a password reset, the underlying computer is exploited and the new password will just make it into the next advertisement for the stealer log. And so stealer logs are definitely ones that you look at first above everything else, and you do a different triage for them on the defensive side than you do for the other categories of stuff that's being leaked. So when you deal with the stealer log, you have to actually format that machine, remove it from malware, do incident response and triage on that machine rather than just resetting the password. You also have to add, additional IAM and access monitoring to it. And I mean, we have a whole guide at Flare that, talks about what you do in the different sections. But yeah, and then like level 5 now I've added to my list is that people are taking the stuff that does come from even the public web level 1 stuff and the level 4 stuff, all of it, and they're putting it into AI now and adding very easy complexity rules that we've had in the security community for password cracking. So, if you're listening to this podcast, like mentally, if you're using a core seed for your password, right, like a core word or phrase, and then the only thing you're doing is capitalizing the first letter or adding a common symbol after or before it, or putting digits before or after the password. This is about 80% of people do this when they create a new password after being forced to change. AI can permutate a core password that's been breached in any of these levels, and then attackers are starting to replay those and find the changes that your users have made to just satisfy the password complexity rules that they've had to set up when they make a new password. So this is kind of an emerging place. So it is definitely a rabbit hole that we could talk way more on, but yeah, the stealer logs are the number 1 for me, I think.
Yeah. So thank you, Jason. I think that was a fantastic answer. And I will say, when I was younger, like much younger, I used to do that. I would add like an exclamation or something. And then it got really complicated though, because you'd be like, did I use an exclamation @ for this one or a $ sign? It's tough to remember. But
a lot of people just change the year or like they choose a month or they'll change the case. Or people will just go back to a previous password. So if you find a user that you're targeting in it, like when I'm doing a red team assessment, I will not only try the current most stuff in the breach dumps, but also old stuff I've seen in their history too across the, luckily I have access to the Flare database. So, but yeah.
Last question we have are, what are some good strategies for convincing your organization to invest in cyber? And this is a hard one. This is probably the hardest one of the whole day. It seems like we have a lot of companies use we have cyber insurance as an excuse to not spend the money.
Yeah, I wish this was an easy answer. It's not exactly an easy answer. I think it depends on the culture of your organization. What I find is that, you were talking about social media companies, having kind of their S together, right? As far as security program goes, I don't know if we're allowed to, drop curse words on the podcast, but I'm not going to.
I have no rules.
Okay. But the reason that they have that is because they're, starting to be one of the most highly regulated type of tech companies. That's one reason. The pressure's there from government entities, private auditors, compliances, etc. And then also most of them have been breached before. And for them, it is the biggest black eye to have been breached. And so what I find is that most companies who've experienced a very big incident of some sort, they're the ones who end up investing into cyber. So like, what if you're one of those companies that hasn't had a big incident, right? Like, how do you convince and change culture? usually it's creating a case study about competitors who have had those incidents and what kind of monetary loss it caused the business. And this is not just, talking about like credentials that made it out and you have to pay you have to pay the monitoring services for your users and stuff like that. It's like, what did the downtime cost your employees and your developers and your services? And, in the gaming industry, downtime for a game is crazy. You lose a ton of money when your games are down and stuff like that. And so building out this case study and really presenting it as a leader to the board and your other executives and say, hey, this is what we're hedging against. This is what we're investing against. And here are the numbers. And that is not a science yet. I mean, actuaries in the cybersecurity field. I went to the Black Hat CISO Summit today, and there was a great talk on trying to unmask, and we've been doing this for like 10 years, unmask the cost of a breach. But what you have is a lot of marketing studies that'll tell you the cost of a breach, but not a lot of actuary data. Because companies guard that. And so one of the speakers at the summit had actually compiled a database of what different breaches cost. And it was staggering. The numbers were crazy. Like if you were to show any executive or board member like that, you're going to spend all out on an incident that, that you could have invested or hedged a bet against, and you're going to lose, anywhere from $15 to $22 million or something like that. Like, of course, they're going to invest in your leaked creds program that you're going to pay $15,000 for to like build a team, get a platform, like, of course they're going to do that. But that actuary data hasn't been available like for a ton of us for a long time. So that's my soapbox answer. I could talk about that one too for quite a while. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys. We are at time today. I really appreciate everybody showing up. I think it was a fantastic discussion. I did not share the questions with the audience in advance, or the other presenters in advance, and so they did a terrific job with my unscripted wild interview tactics. Have a great day, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.